Welcome to the featured presentation portion of today's program. Each talk will be 15 minutes with an additional 5 minutes for Q&A. So each talk will actually be about 10 to 15 minutes. We told the students 15 minutes max. All right. Our first speaker is Lansing Horan, a graduate student in Professor Jack Hare's group. Lansing's research is in fusion plasma physics, and he will be presenting today on Shadowgraphy measurements of radiatively-cooled magnetic reconnection layer. All right, Lansing, you want to take it away?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Anza. My name is Lansing, and I'm a third-year NSE student. Today I'll talk about shadowgraphy measurements of a radiatively-cooled magnetic reconnection layer. This presentation will aim to break down this title into the key terms. So we'll start with magnetic reconnection. So to orient you into what magnetic reconnection is, it is a fundamental process that occurs everywhere in the universe where there is magnetized plasma, which is most of the universe. So to start out, we have a simple two-dimensional cartoon. Imagine we have two blobs of plasma on a collision course, and that these blobs of plasma happen to have anti-parallel magnetic fields. If we assume that the plasma is ideal, this means that the magnetic field lines will move with the plasma flows, like that shown here. Now, due to an electrodynamic effect, whenever we have oppositely oriented magnetic field lines close to each other, we generate a large electric current, such as that shown here in green, pointing out of the board. The benefit of this current, or one implication, is it allows the magnetic field lines to further diffuse into each other, eventually overlapping at the center and achieving magnetic reconnection. This is where the magnetic field lines overlap and annihilate themselves at the center. The object in our system that we'll focus on for this talk is at the center in yellow. This is the reconnection layer. This is simply the region where magnetic reconnection occurs. It is a small location of the overall plasma environment. So with that background, why should we care about magnetic reconnection? What ramifications does it have? So first, as we could see on this, with this animation of a solar flare, which happens pretty frequently with our sun, magnetic reconnection is often an explosive process. In breaking the magnetic field lines, it allows for violent plasma eruptions. And then secondly, reconnection is a heating mechanism. The plasma is energized where the magnetic field lines annihilate. Energy is transferred from the magnetic field lines to the plasma. This leads to additional interesting effects that we'll talk about in the coming slides. So with this background for magnetic reconnection, let's talk about the specific type of reconnection that we're interested in, radiatively-cooled reconnection. So the question naturally is, how does radiative cooling affect the reconnection layer? Again, I have a simple two-dimensional diagram here on the slides, and we just learned that reconnection is a heating process. So the plasma in the layer is hot. In order to cool itself off, it's going to release energy. It's going to emit X-rays. This has the effect of course, decreasing the temperature of the plasma in the layer, and also, of course, lowering the thermal pressure. But we still have the constant streams, the flowing streams from the left and the right of the layer. And so if the thermal pressure of the layer is decreased, it allows those inflowing plasma streams to further compress the layer, thereby increasing the density M. The last bit of information that we need to complete an interesting circuit, an interesting positive feedback loop, is knowing that the X-ray power scales with the density squared. So if we're increasing the density by compressing the layer due to radiation, we're actually ending up with more X-ray emission than what we started with. So this is a positive feedback loop. So the answer to the question at the title of this slide is radiative cooling drives the layer plasma colder and denser as time progresses. So there's an interesting interplay between reconnection as a heating process and radiation as a cooling process. So why should we care about this specific type of reconnection? The first and foremost reason is this type of reconnection with radiation is pervasive across a huge range of astrophysical conditions. It occurs everywhere in the universe, both in local environments like the solar chromosphere, as well as environments galaxies away, such as the M87 black hole accretion disk. Secondly, theorists believe that the radiative spectra that we receive from space plasma environments that we record in telescopes is the result of magnetic reconnection as the driving heating process inducing that radiation. So this is our key, if not only, observational signature for astrophysical environments. So if we want to better understand the radiative spectra that our telescopes capture, we need to understand the fundamental process that generates that radiation, which is magnetic reconnection. Okay, so with this background, we can have an open question in this specific, very niche research field. And that question is, how does the layer structure evolve in time during radiative collapse? But before we can immediately answer this question, we need to figure out how do we even address this? How can we actually gain any understanding here? So by my count, there are 4 different ways that we can evaluate magnetic reconnection theory. First is computer simulations. These are great, these are powerful, but like a lot of simulation work, there's always the question of initial conditions. It's not always clear which initial conditions we should assume in our numerical modeling, and these could have a great impact on the end result that we receive. Also, there's always the question of how much can we really trust the numerical outputs that we're getting, because we're not sure if we're accurately modeling all of the richness of physics involved in this process. The second way to evaluate the theory is in situ measurements. This is just saying, what if we take a probe and send it to the location where magnetic reconnection is occurring? But for our case of trying to learn about astrophysical plasmas, this is a non-starter. These environments are too extreme or simply way too far for us to ever send a probe and actually measure reconnection at its location. A third technique is remote observations. So this is what I mentioned before, where we have telescopes which capture radiative spectra from all throughout the universe. But we can't infer everything we need from radiation alone. It would be better if we could have other plasma parameters like the velocity, the density, the temperature, in order to more fundamentally understand where this radiation is coming from. So that leaves us with our 4th and final option, lab experiments, and that's what we'll focus on for this talk here. The benefit of lab experiments is we have a controlled environment to measure in detail and up close the specific plasma physics at play. So, bringing it back to the open question, we're going to answer this with a laboratory astrophysics experiment. This brings us to the secret hidden part of this title, Sandia's Z machine, which is the location, the facility where we conduct our experiments. For those of you who don't know, the Z machine at Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is the world's largest pulsed power device. This is a slice through the center of the overall machine. It is absolutely massive. It is 33 meters in diameter. And just for reference, in red, that's about the size, the height of a typical person. This whole machine is in a giant warehouse out in the middle of the desert. And working our way from the very outer diameter and then inwards, starting out with the capacitor banks in green, this is where electricity is charged up prior to an experiment on the Z machine. And then this machine is so complicated and large and designed in order to deliver a huge amount of electricity to a very small area in the center of the machine, in the vacuum chamber. In the bottom right, this is an actual photograph of 2 Sandia technicians working and preparing for an experiment prior to a shot on the Z machine. Again, to give you a sense of scale. And one of the last things I'll show is at the very tip of those orange arrows, in that little tiny circular region, that's the size of our experiments. This is where all of our plasma physics are actually occurring. So we need this absolutely massive machine to deliver 20 million amps of electricity to a volume that's maybe 100 cubic centimeters. We need the Z machine in order to reach high energy density physics regimes. Again, to give you senses of scale, at the outer diameter of the machine, the power per volume density is about 200 watts per cubic meter, just as an order of magnitude. For reference, a light bulb, 60-watt light bulb, is about 300,000 watts per cubic meter, so 200 is, it's pretty benign. Like, not much interesting is happening there. But, interestingly, at our target, at the experiment, we achieve about 200,000 trillion watts per cubic meter in terms of energy density. This is why we need the Z machine. This is the only machine where we could actually reach this insane level of energy density. For reference, a nuclear fission reactor is about 10 billion watts per cubic meter. So this brings us to magnetic reconnection on Z, Mars. That is the name of our collaboration with Sandia. This is a picture that we started out with on the title slide. This is a picture of the load hardware. So this is our experiment, basically, at that really small volume at the center of the Z machine. On the next slide, I'll explain why we field these, what we call wire arrays. But for now, to give you a sense of scale, each wire array is 40 millimeters in size, which, for reference, is the diameter of a ping pong ball. The space between each wire array is about 20 millimeters, so half a ping pong ball. And on each array, it might be a bit hard to see, but arranged in a cylindrical cage, there are 150 aluminum wires on each of the wire arrays, so 300 total. And each of these metal wires is only 75 microns thick, so that's the size of a human hair. This entire system is incredibly complex, takes months of planning, and I don't know how the Sandia technicians actually build these things, but it's amazing. Shown in purple is the path of the electrical current that the Z machine delivers to our metal targets. We reach 20 million amps of electricity in less than a millionth of a second on the Z machine, which again is what we need in order to generate a lot of radiation in our plasma environment. So everything I just showed you was two exploding wire arrays. And the reason that we use these devices is because they allow us to generate magnetic reconnection in that laboratory environment. So with that current path in purple on a single wire array, this has the geometry we need to generate radially diverging flows of plasma emanating from each of those wires. And so if we place two wire arrays next to each other, the most interesting region of this diagram is in the center. So we see that we have flowing streams of plasma coming from the left and the right, meeting at the midplane, and they're carrying anti-parallel magnetic field lines. This is consistent with that cartoon example of magnetic reconnection. So this is why we field what we field. So bringing it back to this question. So now we have the background, we have the theory, we have the experiment, but now we need to choose how do we actually diagnostically measure this? How do we get any information about the layer structure? That brings us to the first word of the title, shadowgraphy. Before I talk about the specific application of shadowgraphy on our experiments, I just want to give you some intuition for what shadowgraphy is. It's a phenomena that we are all familiar with. When we've been outside on a bright sunny day next to a pool, we've seen the rays of light strike the surface of the water, and due to the wave patterns at the top as well as throughout the pool, we've seen that there's interesting patterns of light and dark that form at the bottom. So this is essentially due to the changes in the index of refraction bending the rays of light. So in our case, we're going to apply shadowgraphy where our light source is not the sun, but instead it's a high-intensity laser, and our medium is not water, but instead a plasma fluid. So that's shown with this cartoon here. We are looking at the top down on the two wire arrays. At the center, we have our reconnection layer. This plasma only exists for less than a millionth of a second, but we carefully time a laser pulse to shine through the entirety of the reconnection layer during that experiment. Looking at cross-sections of the laser beam profile, so looking at the side, initially, ideally, our laser beam profile is uniform. It's flat. It's traveling through vacuum. But at the bottom right, we see that the image of that laser beam profile that we collect has artifacts, has the imprinting of the reconnection layer itself within it. We see that the rays of light have been deflected outwards, away from the region of highest density. So this is the last thing I will show you for today. These are going to be the experimental shadowgrams from our Mars IV experiments from April of last year. And a shadowgram is just the name of what we just saw, the camera snapshot of the laser beam intensity profile. And for reference at the top, I'm showing you the side view of our system, again reminding you that we are shining the laser beam into the board through the entire reconnection layer. So from our experiment last year, these are the 4 images of our laser beam profile that we collected. these are the first images of a radiatively cooled magnetic reconnection layer. Not a very popular field, but we were the first. And moving from left to right, the amount of time is only about 40 nanoseconds. So we can see a huge amount of variation in a very short time frame. And I'll remind you of our open question. How does the layer structure evolve in time during radiative collapse? And I'll quickly give you 4 qualitative observations we can immediately make from these images. First, in the center, we see a dark central void. This is the result of the reconnection layer being denser than its surroundings, deflecting light outwards. Second, we see enhanced bands of intensity of bright features outside the reconnection layer. This is the result of shock waves which form in our system because our plasma flows are moving supersonically. Second, especially in that third image, we see small-scale variation in the z direction, moving up and down in our images. The fact that we see these variations indicates that we have instabilities of interest in our plasma, which we hope to further quantify. And then fourth, especially shown on that final frame, the fact that that dark central void in the images appears to be getting larger and larger with time is consistent with the idea that the density in the reconnection layer is increasing as time passes, the layer compression, due to radiative cooling. So with this, we've broken down all the key terms in the title, and very briefly, 4 quick takeaways. First, magnetic reconnection is an energizing process. It heats the layer plasma. Second, radiative cooling is pervasive in astrophysical plasmas, and it drives the layer to be colder and denser as time progresses. Third, the Mars platform on Sandia's Z machine allows us to study extreme plasma physics in an up-close and detailed manner. And fourth and finally, laser shadowgraphy is the technique that we're using in order to image how the layer structure evolves during the radiative collapse. Thank you. No questions is okay. I'm good with that.
I asked this earlier, but does this need like 2 independent plasmas to hit each other, or could you see this in a tokamak where like you have some crazy?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So it could be 2 initially separate plasmas that happen to be on a collision course and then impact each other. It could be that, or I think more commonly, like a plasma itself is often kind of a very fluid and turbulent thing. So naturally, if you have this big plasma soup, it has a lot of turbulent motions within it. So it's almost like internal to the plasma, these magnetic field lines are moving about and getting twisted about. So it's almost inevitable that eventually there's going to be a region, if not multiple regions, where magnetic reconnection occurs, even within the same blob. Does that make sense?
Yeah, would that sort of turbulence be enough pressure to get one of these like reconnection events, or do you need them to sort of slam into each other?
I believe the inflow velocity. I don't think you need it to slam into each other per se, but you do need. I mentioned at the very beginning we were assuming that the plasma is ideal, which means that the field lines move as the plasma moves. So what we do need is not necessarily them to slam into each other, but we do need a mechanism for the field lines to actually move independently of the plasma flows. And that there are different ways that you can go, there are different ways that can happen. But I don't think that's requisite of flows slamming into each other.
Cool, thank you.
And I can ask you one. Your images, your shadowgrams, are the very integrated effect of what has happened to that laser. How much effort do you expect you'll have to do in trying to reconstruct backwards what has actually happened?
Sorry, how much what?
How much work in reconstructing what has actually happened? Reconstruction of those images.
Yeah, I might have a slide on this. Okay, I don't think I do. Sorry. So that's currently what we're working on right now. We're trying to. Sorry. trying to take these images and, for instance, we want to quantify the density jump across this shock front. So the way that we're doing that is a combination of numerical modeling. We have a Monte Carlo ray trace code that we can use synthetically to go about this, but we also have, we're trying to take an analytical approach as well, where we can have a forward model, if you will, where we assume a shock profile and then tune the parameters within that function that best reproduce the intensity profiles we see. So that's currently what we're working on. And that's why I didn't include it in this talk, but we're working on that.
I have sort of a general question. So you're showing these shadowgrams. When you guys were setting up this experiment, were there any like particular challenges? Like, did it work right away, or was there like a lot of troubleshooting you had to do? Just, you know, when we do experiments, right, things really work right away. So I'm just curious how that went.
Yeah. So we, in the lead up to this experiment, which again was 1 year ago in April, we spent at least 6 months preparing for fielding this diagnostic for the first time.
Yeah.
This, like our experiment here, this was, I think, maybe the second or third experiment that Sandia actually used laser shadowgraphy on. So it's a very new technique for their facility. And we did a lot of, I mentioned the ray trace code that we have. So we have 3D MHD modeling of our plasma system, like the entire system and the evolution of the reconnection layer. So we took that 3D electron density mesh and then fed it through the ray trace code, and then we used that sort of simulation type modeling in order to design the actual fielding of this diagnostic in the experiment. So we got to choose where to position the lens, what the focal length should be,
And
how do we...
It worked the first time.
Yeah. So like it did work for the first time, which was like,
Congratulations.
it was kind of very fortunate. Very high stakes because we only get 1 or 2 shots on Z a year.
Right.
So if it didn't work, then
Yeah. No, that shows
Yeah.
how hard the team worked on that. That's really impressive.
yeah. But there was a lot of preparatory work to maximize our chance
Yeah,
that it
of
would work.
course.
So
Right.
yeah.
Thank you.
yeah.
Need to move on.